What would you do if you stumbled upon a footage of a brutal crime? In 2019, a stolen memory card turned out to be a window into one of Alaska's most horrifying murders. The footage was so shocking, it led detectives down a dark path of secrets and terror. Let's dive into the case of the Alaska memory card murders. It all began on 30 September 2019 when the police in Alaska Anchorage received a call from a woman claiming she found a memory card on the ground. So she picked it up to see if upon inspecting it she can find the owner. But what she found horrified her. The memory card labeled homicide at Midtown Marriott was immediately seized by the police, and the detectives with the Alaska Anchorage Homicide Department pulled up the contents of the memory card on a computer. The detectives were shocked to find 39 images of a bloodied naked woman on the floor next to a bed, then covered with a blanket in a luggage cart. 12 videos of the same woman being repeatedly beaten and strangled, while a strong, distinctive British South African voice narrates as if to an audience and urges the woman to die, saying everyone always dies in his movies. The voice continues to ask as if in a rhetorical manner what his followers are going to think of him and say people need to know when they are being serial killed. From the photos and videos, the detectives determined the woman was murdered in the first week of September. On the 2nd of October 2019, the Alaska Anchorage police received another call about human remains discovered by a traveler in the southern part of Anchorage. The remains seemed to have been disposed for several weeks. The detectives hoped to have found their victim from the memory card. With knowledge about the perpetrator, the detectives began scouring the footage for clues. The breakthrough came when they recognized the strong British South African accent from a prior investigation. The voice was identified as that of Brian Stephen Smith. Brian Stephen Smith was born in 1971. He is a South African-born citizen from Queenstown in the Eastern Cape province. After college, Brian Stephen Smith joined the South African Army and was radicalized. He posted about his experience with the South African Army on social media and ranted against black South Africans without even masking his pro-apartheid views. In 2013, Brian Stephen Smith met Stephanie Bisland, an American ex-immigration agent, through an online gaming community. In March 2014, Brian Stephen Smith moved from South Africa to the United States, and in May the very same year, they got married. Brian Stephen Smith became a US citizen through naturalization in September 2019. The police could not arrest Brian Stephen Smith without any concrete evidence. The memory card was labeled homicide at Midtown Marriott, and Marriott has multiple hotels in Anchorage. The detectives had to compare the decoration of the room from the videos with that of hotels to narrow down their search. Once the detectives found the hotel, they searched the hotel's reservation records and compared the timestamps with that of the photos and videos. And from the list, they found the name of Brian Stephen Smith. The detectives found that Brian Stephen Smith checked into the hotel on the 2nd of September 2019 and checked out on the 4th of September 2019. The detectives also found that the car seen on the videos was similar to the 1999 Ford Ranger pickup truck that Brian Stephen Smith owned. The detectives went on to get a warrant for Brian Stephen Smith's cell phone records, and they discovered his location pinged just a few yards away from where the victim's body was discovered. On 8 October 2019, Brian Stephen Smith was arrested as he was arriving in Anchorage from a trip. He was arrested at the Ted Stevens International Airport. During the interrogation, when Brian Stephen Smith was confronted with the photos and videos, he told detectives the woman from the photos and videos was not his only victim. Brian Stephen Smith confessed to murdering another woman in 2018. Brian Stephen Smith told the detectives sometime in 2018 he picked a woman up while his wife was out of town. The woman smelled but refused to take a shower, so he became upset, retrieved his pistol from the garage, and shot her in the head. Brian Stephen Smith went on to identify the woman from a picture as a 52-year-old Alaska Native woman, Veronica Roslyn Abochak. He then went on and provided the location where he disposed her body. Veronica Abochak was reported missing by her family in February 2019. Veronica Abochak suffered from homelessness and was last seen by her family in July 2018 and last seen at a cafe in October 2018. Despite suffering from homelessness, Veronica would sometimes go home or contact her family. So in 2018, when months went by and her family did not hear from her, they became worried. But after learning she was not even picking up her monthly checks from the State Permanent Fund, which was her only source of income, they knew something was wrong. So they filed for a missing persons report with Anchorage police. In 2018, the police discovered a body with Veronica Abochak's identity document and concluded it was her. But also in April 2018, the police discovered a skull with a gunshot wound in the area Brian Stephen Smith identified. On 10 October 2019, the body discovered by a traveler in the southern part of Anchorage on the 2nd of October was identified through dental records as of a 30-year-old woman, Kathleen Jo Henry, another Alaska Native woman who suffered from homelessness and addiction. Kathleen Jo Henry was in and out of jail. She was released from prison in June 2019 after serving 5 months on charges of assault. Just 3 months after being released from prison, Kathleen Jo Henry was brutally tormented and murdered. Authorities confirmed she was the victim whose murder was recorded at the hotel in Marriott. With the information provided by Brian Stephen Smith, Veronica Abochak's case was re-examined, and on 11 October 2019, the skull with the gunshot wound was confirmed through dental records as of Veronica Abochak's. On 16 October 2019, Brian Stephen Smith was indicted with charges of murder and sexual assault in the death of Kathleen Jo Henry. On 17 October 2019, he was indicted with first-degree murder in the death of Veronica Abochak, 2 counts of second-degree murder, 2 counts of tampering with evidence, and 1 count of misconduct involving a corpse. Brian Stephen Smith pleaded not guilty to all charges, and he was held in custody on a $2 million bond. Throughout the trial, debate over the memory card was a great source of dispute, as well as the credibility of Valerie Kassler, the woman who gave the police the memory card. Brian Stephen Smith's attorney sought to have the memory card's evidence, or even the mention of it, excluded at the trial. Valerie Kassler, the woman who gave the police the memory card, changed her statements over the years about how she came into possession of the memory card. Initially, she told the police she found it on the ground. When she was interviewed for the second time, she claimed to have stolen it from the center console of Brian Stephen Smith's pickup truck while he tried to get money from an ATM, even revealing she had the memory card for about a week before turning it in to the police. For that reason, Brian Stephen Smith's attorney argued that the prosecution would not be able to demonstrate the origin of the 39 images and 12 videos, or establish if they were originals or duplicates, or say for sure whether they had been tampered with or not. Bryan Steven Smith's attorney told the court the state could not produce a witness to testify if the videos fairly and accurately portray any act that actually happened. The judge then ruled Valerie Kassler can testify how she came into possession of the memory card and if the recordings can be verified to be authentic. Valerie Kassler, a sex worker with a long criminal history of theft, assault, and prostitution, testified after she was promised not to be indicted. Valerie told the jury she actually stole Bryan Steven Smith's cell phone from his pickup truck and not a memory card. Valerie told the court she did not know sex workers have immunity from prostitution charges when reporting a crime. She also said she was afraid of being arrested for stealing Bryan Steven Smith's cell phone. Valerie told the jury when she charged the phone, she found 46 images and 1 video. She then transferred them to a memory card she stole from a department store and labeled it homicide at Midtown Marriott and handed it over to the police. During the trial, the police and the prosecution showed how Bryan Steven Smith preyed on vulnerable women who suffered from homelessness, addiction, or mental illness for sexual encounters which turned violent. The prosecution presented cell phone evidence of photos and videos documenting the murder of Kathleen Jo Henry. The court was arranged in a way that only Bryan Steven Smith, the jury, and those involved could see the last moments of Kathleen Jo Henry, but everyone else could hear the audio of Kathleen Jo Henry being tormented and finally gasping for a breath of air before dying. The prosecution told the jury Bryan Steven Smith moved around with Kathleen Jo Henry's body in the back of his pickup truck for 2 days before finally disposing her body. The jury was also shown Bryan Steven Smith's police-recorded interview in which he was confronted with the photos and videos, and he went on to confess to murdering another woman, later identified as Veronica Abuchak. The prosecution told the jury Bryan Steven Smith promised Veronica Abuchak a place to stay, free food and alcohol when he picked her up in 2018. The prosecution went on and presented a video from Bryan Steven Smith's cell phone, which was seized by the police, showing Bryan Steven Smith toying with Veronica Abuchak's dead body. The prosecution also presented Facebook and text exchange messages between Bryan Steven Smith and a heavy metal drummer. Bryan Steven Smith bragged to at least 2 people about the murders, and the prosecution said he seemed to be proud of what he had done. Bryan Steven Smith also confided about the murders to his ex-girlfriend, who went to the police to warn them about Bryan Steven Smith and led them to investigate him. Bryan Steven Smith's ex-girlfriend, Alicia Youngblood, testified in front of the grand jury about what Bryan Steven Smith told her before she died from suicide in 2021. Bryan Steven Smith's attorney argued in closing statements that Valerie's testimony alone was enough to give the jury reasonable doubt, saying whether Valerie wanted to hide something, or she doesn't have a good memory, or she wanted the limelight. She was a very comfortable and constant liar, stressing it was very reasonable to doubt her. The defense told the court the state started their case with weak evidence and DNA testimony to support the case was not done. Bryan Steven Smith's attorney told the jury the October 2019 interrogation was put together to trick his client, Bryan Steven Smith, to confess, even calling the interrogation 8 hours of prepared psychological warfare. The prosecution requested the jury to consider the totality of the presented evidence during closing statements. The prosecution reminded the jury the reason they were all gathered in court was because Brian Stephen Smith brutally murdered 2 women. The prosecution requested the jury to convict Brian Stephen Smith, saying the state had proved the case beyond a reasonable doubt, and it was further difficult to explain the brutality and heartlessness Brian Stephen Smith perpetrated on both victims. On the 22nd of February 2024, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours and found Brian Stephen Smith guilty of the murders of 30-year-old Kathleen Jo Henry and 52-year-old Veronica Abochak, who died respectively in September 2019 and in August 2018. Brian Stephen Smith was found guilty of all the charges he was indicted with. The jury also found that an aggravated factor of substantial physical torture applies in the first-degree murder of Kathleen Jo Henry. In April 2024, before Brian Stephen Smith was sentenced, a federal grand jury in Alaska indicted Brian Stephen Smith with unlawfully obtaining naturalization in the U.S. Brian Stephen Smith applied and obtained naturalization in the U.S. in September 2019, just 2 weeks after murdering Kathleen Jo Henry. Brian Stephen Smith was accused of making false statements in his naturalization application by falsely responding to questions asking him if he had been involved in any killing, sexual assault, or badly hurting a person, if he had assisted a person to commit a crime or attempted to commit a crime he was not arrested for. He answered no, while knowingly at the time of the application he had committed 2 murders, with 1 murder involving torture and assault. As part of a sentencing memorandum filed with the court, the prosecution included photos from Brian Stephen Smith's cell phone from 2019. The photos showed a woman who is not Kathleen Jo Henry or Veronica Abochak lying on the ground, incapacitated and bloody. The woman was not identified or confirmed to be dead or alive. When Brian Stephen Smith was confronted with the photos, he said he left the woman unconscious. The prosecution suggested a death victim and told the court Brian Stephen Smith was truly evil and he had certainly harmed the woman. During sentencing, the judge said both Kathleen Jo Henry and Veronica Abochak were treated as horribly as a person can be treated. The judge described Brian Stephen Smith as a person so dangerous that if he ever gets released, he is likely to kill again. The judge said Brian Stephen Smith was amongst the worst offenders in each of the charges he was indicted with, saying for his own pleasure, he ruthlessly killed Kathleen Jo Henry and Veronica Abochak, and in the case of Kathleen Jo Henry, filming her torture and murder. The judge called both victims by their name, which usually doesn't happen in court, as victims are typically called by their initials instead of their full names. The judge said he would call both victims by their names to some extent, restore their dignity. Alaska does not have the death penalty. On 12 July 2024, Brian Stephen Smith was sentenced to 226 years in prison. He was sentenced to 99 years for the murder of Kathleen Jo Henry and 99 years for the murder of Veronica Abochak. The remaining 28 years was for charges of assault and tampering with evidence. Through it all, Brian Stephen Smith's wife, Stephanie Beesland, stood by her husband, saying she had said vows and Brian Stephen Smith was in fact a good husband to her. In July 2024, the family of Cassandra Liposkovsky, a 38-year-old Alaska Native woman who was reported missing by her family in September 2019, publicly identified her as the woman whose pictures were submitted by the prosecution as part of a sentencing memorandum during the murder trial of Kathleen Jo Henry and Veronica Abochak. Cassandra was last seen in August 2019. Despite facing personal struggles, including struggling with alcohol and unstable living conditions, Cassandra maintained regular contact with her family and the adoptive and foster parents of her children. However, the Alaska Anchorage Police Department stated more evidence was needed to conclusively identify the woman in the photos. Cassandra's family and supporters protested outside the Anchorage Police Department and expressed their dissatisfaction with how Cassandra's case had been handled and demanded justice. Cassandra's family also filed a petition with Anchorage Superior Court for a presumptive death hearing, stating Cassandra was Brian Steven Smith's third victim, saying they recognized her with her distinctive features such as her neck tattoo. Presumptive death hearings are common in Alaska. Hikers, hunters, and boaters often go missing. A presumptive death hearing is held when a person has disappeared for an extended period without any recovery of remains and if there is reasonable belief that the person has died. In September 2024, an Anchorage 6-person jury held the presumptive death hearing for Cassandra, aimed to provide legal closure for Cassandra's family. During the hearing, family members and advocates presented evidence, including photos retrieved from Brian Steven Smith's cell phone, showing a woman believed to be Cassandra, in a state suggesting she was deceased. The jury unanimously concluded Cassandra Poskovsky was deceased and had been a victim of a homicide. Despite the jury's declaration, the Anchorage Police Department has stated, as of September 2024, they had not been able to conclusively identify the woman in the photos as Cassandra Poskovsky, citing the need for more definitive evidence. The investigation into the disappearance and presumed death of Cassandra Poskovsky remains ongoing. What do you think about this chilling case? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories.